So from this kind of effort to make sense out of Canadian anthropology, which had a trajectory of sorts, one needs to then go back to other kinds of history of anthropology work that I did at various times that came out of a different side of my thinking about the history of anthropology. One of them was that I got embroiled dramatically in the centennial of the American Anthropological Association in 2002. Jane Hill was then the incoming president of the AAA, and history of anthropology is something, particularly history of Americanist anthropology, is something that Jane feels very strongly about. And that was a stretch when, as president of the Society for Humanistic Anthropology, I was on the board for a year of the AAA. And that was the year that they were putting together ways of acknowledging the centennial. So because of Jane's enthusiasm, we managed to make that something that had a huge history of anthropology component, which I appreciated immensely. She appointed me as the head of a centennial commission and allowed me to appoint its membership, which I proceeded to do, including a lot of my dear old friends. As it turned out, the AAA did not maintain the commitments it had made in principle to support us getting together to meet and to do various things. However, we did do some things that I thought were extremely important. One of them was a special issue of the American Anthropologist, which I edited with Fred Leach. Now, Fred and I had, he's a Chicago PhD student of Ray Fogelson's, who was a student of Pete Hallowell's and a dear friend of George Stocking's, and so there are always multiple sort of things. Anyway, Fred and I took one look at each other and decided we were going to be friends for life, and we have remained so. He comes into various other parts of the history of anthropology story. And so Fred and I decided that we would do a special issue of The Anthropologist and dragooned various people into writing very different kinds of papers. It wasn't entirely what we had hoped for, but it was an interesting collection and a fairly broad one. The other thing that we did together initially was a centennial countdown column in Anthropology News, which ran most months for almost 2 years, in which one or the other of us would dream up something to babble about for a column, like a couple hundred words. But I think it kept many things in focus. And as part of that, we envisioned spending some time with the living presidents of the American Anthropological Association, of which there were give or take 20. I've forgotten the exact number at this point. But we did hunt them all up and chat with them in various ways. That eventually became a volume of centennial portraits, drawing on the relationship that I already had with the University of Nebraska Press. That the Centennial Portraits volume is about a 4-page blurb, half of one page of which is a picture of each of the presidents of the AAA. And that, I think, was an absolutely fascinating exercise. Some of them, of course, are people that we could interview and talk with. And some of them are, this is an archival project, and Fred and I did most of those. Fred and I did most of the sketches in the book, but where we could, we tried to get others to contribute too, and often did so in interesting ways. A couple of them were so edited by the living president that I was embarrassed to put my name on them. But, you want to tell your story this way. Interesting. Most of them just corrected minor things or pointed out things that were important to them that had not been included. But I think it was a really nice project because you can follow. Now, I would never put myself in a position of picking a sample from a population of all American anthropologists. First of all, you can't close who is and who isn't one. So it's not a population in one sense. And you need some kind of rubric that will say, who shall we talk to? And for a century period, we've got a bunch of folks that there's a lot of information about, almost all of them, that we could put together. And if you read consecutively, you can find out quite a lot about how the discipline was changing and what sorts of people were seen as leaders of the discipline. And I think that was a really important kind of thing to have us say. I like that volume. It didn't sell a lot of copies, but I think it's an important book. And the other thing we did, there had been for a long time a series of selected papers from the American Anthropologist. Freddie de Laguna did the first one that came out in '65 when I was still in Philadelphia, with a very long and very good introductory essay, I think it's 90 pages, by Pete Hallowell, which was a good sort of frame-off. Then George Stocking edited one on the interwar years. Yeah. And then we had a sort of trying to bring it up to date a bit, third volume that Bob Murphy did. And it wasn't very history of anthropology oriented and didn't have a serious framing essay. So I found that one a little disappointing. But anyway, I, with my usual, oh well, why not, decided that we needed a volume 4. So I put together something that went from 71 to 95, which means that I don't know that read is quite the right word, but at least skimmed, as opposed to just read the table of contents. Came up with a short list of about twice what we could actually put in the volume, and then consulted various people about how to pare it down. And I think came up with a volume that has some really good stuff in it that might be hard to find all by itself. And they range from very theoretical things like distinguished lectures to the AAA, to very concrete ethnographic descriptions. The only one that's explicitly history of anthropology, as I recall, is Len Glick on Boaz's Jewish roots. He's the person that taught that Anthropology in the Classics course in 1 year at Bryn Mawr long, long ago. Networks keep coming back on each other. Anyway, so we had that one, and the centennial portraits and the special issue, and then all those columns. And I think that it created a certain awareness of the history of the discipline that may not have been there before. There had been a History of Anthropology newsletter since 1973, which the children's father and I printed for some years, although George Stocking was certainly the editor, and he was a controlling editor, out of our basement printing press operation. And that worked out okay. It has now been relaunched very recently by some people who are more history of science and less anthropology oriented, and they're very interesting, at the University of Pennsylvania, after the death of the second editor, Ricky Kuklik, who wasn't an anthropologist either, though she wrote about the history of anthropology. Okay, so there was that. Then the other piece that kind of goes along with that is editorial. Gary Dunham, as North American editor for Anthropology at the University of Nebraska Press, approached me about trying to do something that might produce a journal, or possibly something to compete with George Stocking's series at Nebraska. And so we ended up, Fred Leach and I decided to work on putting together something that we ultimately called Histories of Anthropology Annual. It's gone back and forth between the book and the journal's sections at Nebraska. Volume 12 is underway. Volume 11 is at the printers. There was a gap for a couple years in the middle because of all these difficulties with who's doing what when. So we started it considerably earlier than 11 years ago. However, I don't think I'd be willing to take on a journal with 4 issues a year. But there's one thing where we can try to both give a place to publish history of anthropology, which is directed at anthropologists. If you look at the classic papers in history of anthropology, they're all over the place, and they're hard to find, and you could miss them easily. So we wanted an outlet of that sort, not thematic like Stocking's Wisconsin series, which would have one wild card in each volume, but basically was around a theme each time. And we agreed that we weren't going to do that, no more than 3 papers that hung together, basically. But that we would hope that internally there would be contrasts, and we never write the how this volume hangs together part of the introduction until everything else is in finished manuscript, and then, okay, here's what we did. Or here's what happened in a kind of emergent sort of way. The monograph series now has more than 25 volumes in it. The first was my invisible genealogies. I'll get back to that eventually, probably. And that one was again a sense of where do you look for things in the history of anthropology, and where do you find a press that's willing to have a list so that people will look there for it. And I think we've been very successful in that. A lot of people approach us wanting to do a manuscript. And now that one I'm doing in collaboration with my colleague Stephen Murray, who is based in Berkeley and who is a sociologist who has studied history of anthropology, and linguistic anthropologist, I suppose, mostly by way of John Gumpers. So Steve and I have done that series, and Fred and I have done the journal, which means that we can talk to people about a project and say, hey, we know what you could do with that. One of the Canadian pieces that I'm really glad we were able to put there is Andy and Harriet Lyon's book on sexuality, which is a wonderful book. I can pick out Andy's sentences in the middle of their single voice every now and then. You know, they balance each other so elegantly. Yeah. So there's a lot of things we've been able to do because of the press commitment. It certainly made a lot possible during the American Anthropological Association centennial. And I will eventually come back to it in terms of the Franz Boas Papers project, because that arose initially from the press. But in the middle of all that, the centennial of the birth of Edward Sapir produced a dramatic, the centennial in 1984 produced a great deal of scholarship, as centennials often do, around the figure of Edward Sapir, who, of course, was one of the most distinguished of Boas's students and the one that is best known on the linguistics side. I had always been fascinated by Sapir because on the one hand, he did all this linguistic stuff, and on the other hand, he did culture and personality stuff, which I was introduced to by Freddie and Pete Hallowell, the linguistic more by way of Dell, who was quite directly a descendant of that tradition, by way of Carl Vogelin. So, or of the first Yale School of Linguistics, as Dell and John Fott called it in their overview of American structuralism. So, when people got together to talk about what to do about the Sapir Centennial at the American Anthropological Association, I think in 1982, it seemed like a very good time to say, oh, I could maybe get into that. There had never been a biography of Sapir. And part of that was that Sapir's second wife, Jean, who had died not long before that, had been quite dramatically opposed to anything biographical. I think she foresaw some kind of expose and really didn't think that was a good idea. And I mean, there are things I didn't put in the biography that are not the world's business, but it seems odd to me. However, she really didn't want to do that, and various people had approached her over the years and been told to go away. After her death, I think the family began to look at the fact that we have biographies, multiple biographies of Margaret Mead. We've got stuff on Ruth Benedict. We've got multiple biographies of Kroeber. And there's stuff on everybody else. Wait a minute, we're forgetting about dear old Dad. And so the 5 Sapir children suddenly had a certain degree of enthusiasm. I kind of volunteered. The only other person that might have been interested would be Judy Modell, who had done the Benedict biography. And so we had talked about maybe doing it together, which didn't go very far. Anyway, I seem to have inherited the project. And Judy went on to do very different kinds of things as an anthropologist. The Sapir project, I remember being absolutely floating on air when it appeared that I had permission to take this on. And I went to, I think it was a Yale reception, because I knew a lot of people there. Hal Conklin was an old buddy, for example, and ran into Bill Fenton, whom I knew through the old Iroquois conferences, and he'd always been very kind to me. And I told him I was going to do a biography of Sapir. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, I didn't know you studied with Edward, dear." No, Bill, he died 4 years before I was born. You don't have to study with someone to write their biography. But it was just such a charming response. You know, I guess I was just so much younger than him that it wouldn't have occurred to him to calculate the dates. Anyway, he was always very supportive of the history of anthropology work, as many people were. Okay. So the thing that fascinated me about Sapir was a mind that would attend to so many things and cross over the perspectives that came from one of them to another. So his forays into psychology, and in the interwar years, his efforts to get psychologists, as the boundary between psychology and psychiatry is becoming semi-professional in those years. It still wasn't fully so. And the sociologists. And when he left Canada in 1925 to go to the University of Chicago, he got involved with the Chicago Sociology that was bankrolled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and a lot of very interdisciplinary kinds of things. And Sapir thrived on that, trying to tie together all this stuff. It was very far from the rest of Boasian anthropology for the most part, because that had remained ethnographic study of American Indians. Sapir tried to draw some of the work he was doing in that direction, but his interdisciplinary colleagues in sociology and psychology were not prepared to move in that direction. On the other hand, he had this very anthropological way of saying, yes, you're interested in this, and you're interested in this, and that's not a problem. That's a resource and an opportunity. And so he seemed to be able to get the most amazing people to sit in the same room at these Rockefeller conferences, most of them in Hanover, New Hampshire, where they would have sessions in the morning and in the evening, but the afternoons were off so that people could play golf and such, because after all, the gentlemen take their holidays to come to these things. Okay. All right, it was a different world, a world of gentlemen scholars, and they were almost all gentlemen. That's not a lack of inclusive language. So I found myself thinking about how Sapir got from one piece of what he did to the other, and how that had to work, and what kind of, I suppose, personality that would produce. At one point, I took the Myers-Briggs personality inventory for Edward Sapir. This is the thing where you answer a bunch of questions and they tell you whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, and whether he was an introvert, and whether you're interested in rational or expressive kinds of of things. And that was interesting because he really was largely intuitive, but he had a rational streak that's interesting. And you sort of go down these categories, and it did occur to me that I might perhaps be biased by the amount of time I had spent immersed in Sapir's work and correspondence and so on. Huge amount of that came from the Ottawa years because he left all of his administrative papers and didn't sort out what was personal from what was administrative. So there's a huge amount of wonderful material in Ottawa, which I spent many happy summers spending a lot of time in. Yeah. So the Myers-Briggs inventory went to several of my colleagues who had also done Sapir archival scholarship, and some of whom had talked to Sapir's still living students, as I also did to a number of them. And we came out pretty well. It was just the last one where you wanted to know how judgmental someone was. And that depended. He could be if it was a particular issue. But on the other hand, when he was kind of listening, he had a pattern gestalt kind of way of listening to things, that ethnographically he was really open to patterns. And in terms of the structure of languages, he was open to not being bound to existing grammatical categories, but to be able to really stretch the configurations of what people knew. And so I think it was very useful, particularly because the Myers-Briggs inventory contains a section on how we would interpret, or what we would expect the childhood of a person who came out in these categories to be. The category we came out with, he was 1% of the population, which may have explained why he was sometimes a tad klutzy in social interactions. People who knew him well adored him. A lot of other people really didn't. It was that kind of personality. But the things that were said about what we might expect of the rational fighting and the conformity socialization stuff being a box that didn't fit, it really made a lot of sense in my trying to understand the largely undocumented childhood and youth of Edward Sapir. There isn't any real documentation, and what you can find incidentally in other things is very thin. So it helped me to understand. Philip Sapir, who was the family caretaker of the heritage, knew he had a fit when he heard about the Myers-Briggs inventory, but yeah, I didn't cite it as factual. Sometimes you have to have some way of contextualizing, and you can't start with the person's first job that has archival documents. You need to have a sense of the whole person. And so I found that fascinating, and I kept trying to find the ways that for Sapir, many things were integrated, whereas for many of his students, they did one side of what he did and did not go beyond that. I've had that kind of dichotomy in my own career. Well, maybe more than but multichotomy in the kinds of things that my students have followed me in being interested in and going in their own directions from, and the ones where they just don't pay much attention to other things. And so I think that what we have is someone to whom the term genius really does apply. It was that capacity to move across and to interrelate and to do a kind of recombinant theory, concentrating on the individual rather than on the group. And I continue to think that he got that right, and the culture and personality movement that followed really largely did not.